In this video, we are going to be focusing on Lightroom, and I'm going to try and teach you about 80% of what you need to be an amazing editor in Lightroom in the next 30 minutes. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Steve Gerard. I'm a photographer based in Montreal, and on this channel we talk about all kinds of stuff to do with photography. And today we're going to focus on Lightroom. I am going to be talking as if you are a beginner to Lightroom, but if you have used Lightroom before, you may well pick up a few tips and tricks that you didn't know, so stick around. In future videos, I'm going to go more in depth into how I actually edit. We're going to show you some weddings and stuff like that I'm going to edit. But for now, let's get into the basics of Lightroom right now. I'm going to be using Adobe Lightroom Classic version 10.2, but if there's some tools or anything else that you don't see in your version, then don't worry too much about it. It should be fairly similar on most things that I do today. When you first launch Lightroom, you should be asked whether you want to start a new catalog or choose one from your existing catalogs. I always use a brand new catalog for every shoot. It stops the catalog from getting too big. That can slow your machine down. It also means that if a catalog gets corrupted, I'm not going to lose tons and tons of editing that I've done over the last few months. And I keep all my catalogs in the same folder as the client's raw files. Before I import any photos, I'm just going to show you the preferences. In the general tab, there's not too much that you need to know there. We can kind of keep it as it is. But in the presets tab, you'll see here show Lightroom develop presets. If you click on that, it's going to show you where all your presets are if you have any. I have tons and tons, but I actually only use a few that are in this little folder, Steve's presets up here. But if you buy any presets or get any presets from somewhere, this is the folder you want to put them in so that when you launch Lightroom, they're going to show up. Pretty much everything in the other tabs I've left as it was when I downloaded Lightroom. It's pretty intuitive on most of this stuff. So let's close that down and let's import some photos. To import your images into Lightroom, you can either drag and drop the folder like this, or you can go up here and import photos and video and then find your folder in the drop-down menu. So these images here are from Amber and Danny's wedding in New Jersey. They've already been culled because I cull all my pictures in Narrative Select. A lot of people use something like Photo Mechanic for that. The reason I do that is just because it's a lot quicker and more intuitive than going through everything in Lightroom. Importing thousands of images into Lightroom and culling that way can be a little bit slow for me. So here you can see in the top right hand corner, we've got 662 photos from this wedding, and anything with a check mark is going to be imported. We can uncheck everything. We can check all. If there's anything we don't want to bring in, we just uncheck it. Before I import all the photos, I want to make a few decisions over on this right hand panel. I always use the standard preview setting. It gives me good quality previews without taking too much time. The one-to-one previews will take a little bit longer to build, but will give you better quality once they're in. So if you're willing to wait, that's a good option, and that will allow you to zoom in and out of your pictures without too much time lag. The minimal and embedded and sidecar options are good if you do decide you're going to cull in Lightroom, because they are fast, but the quality won't be there when you come to edit the actual images. Next, we can choose to build smart previews. This is good if you want to be able to edit the pictures on the go without the hard drive connected to the computer, so you might want to check that. As long as the Lightroom catalog that it builds and the smart previews are on your computer, you'll be able to edit without the hard drive with all your raw files being connected to your computer. I always leave don't import suspected duplicates checked just in case. We don't want to be editing two versions of the same image. Here we can choose to add to a collection. I never do this, but this is just another way of keeping your photos organized, but I'm pretty good at doing that myself. Then if you want to add a preset on import, you can do that here. My preset, which I've built, is called Nukem Baby. So this will apply my preset to everything as it's imported into Lightroom. We can choose to add some metadata. So my Steve Gerard Photography metadata is on every picture after it gets imported. And then we can go down to the bottom right and click import. Up in the top left, you'll see the progress bar as Lightroom is importing and building the previews for you. So you might want to go and make yourself a cup of coffee while that's happening. Although we can start editing straight away while it's building the previews. That's just up to you. Okay, so there you can see 662 photos have been imported. Only one is selected right now. Up in the top right hand corner, you have these different modules. For editing, I'm just going to concentrate on the library and develop module, which is pretty much all I ever use. I don't use anything for book, print, web, slideshows, any of that stuff, but it is there if you want to investigate that further. But for editing purposes, we're just going to stick with library and develop. So at the moment we're in the library module. If you want to get rid of these sidebars, you can just click on this arrow and it'll disappear. It also pops out whenever you need it, and the same on the right hand side. Library module is really good for organizing your pictures, rating them, adding any keywords and things like that, which I never really do. On the right hand side here, you can see all the metadata from the files, so all your exposure and which lens you used, all that kind of stuff. In Library module, you can also make basic editing adjustments like tone control, white balance, exposure. But to fine tune all this stuff, we're going to go into the Develop tab. If you hit the minus key, it can make the thumbnails smaller. If you hit the equals key, it will make them bigger again. And if you double click on a picture, it'll make it full screen. Press escape to go back, or you can go to View, Zoom in. If you are culling your pictures in Lightroom, this is the time to do that. What I would do is, for each one you want to keep, I would press P, and that's going to give you a little flag up here in the left hand corner. And then once you've called them, you can go down here and in the filters tab, hit flagged. Anything that you've given a flag will show up on its own without any of the rejects. If you decide you want to remove a flag from a photo, then you just hit the U key and the flag is gone. Hit P to put it back. At the top here, you have this metadata option, which will tell you, for example, how many pictures you've taken on different lenses. And if you want to just see all the pictures that you've taken on the 35, you just click on that, and all the pictures now showing are just taken on the 35 lens. Here's the ones on the 50. All my photos were taken on the 5D Mark III, but if you were using different cameras, then you can choose between them over here. In the Develop module, you will see each individual picture full screen. You can adjust the size up here or zoom in up here, or just click Fit and it will fit to the frame. You also have the option to zoom in and out down here with this little slider. If you hit the I key, you will see a little bit of information up in the left-hand corner about that photo. Hit I again and you will see things like shutter speed and f-stops, and also which lens you used. Click I again to hide it. This little navigator box in the top left-hand corner allows you to pick different parts of your image where you can zoom in and out. So if I want to see what it says on the sign a bit closer, I can click on that sign or move around and look at different parts of the image. And you can also just drag this box around if you want to look around the frame like that. Below the navigator box, you'll find your presets. If you bought any or made your own, you'll find those here. You can see I've got tons, but I have one folder just for my favorites and they are all in there. Still a lot of presets, but I actually only use about 2 or 3, which are up at the top here. If you just hover your arrow over the presets, you'll get a quick preview of what it's going to look like with each preset before you click on it. When you first get Lightroom, you might notice that there's some presets that come with the program, but they're not something that I've ever really used. I don't find them that useful. And then underneath that, we have the history that will tell you the progress of your editing from the import, which is right here at the bottom. So if you end up editing for ages and ages and then decide you actually want to go back to a certain point, you can do that right here. And below all that, we have the copy and paste. So we can actually copy attributes from this photo and paste them onto another photo. Over in the top right, we have the histogram. This is a representation of the different tones in the image. On the left-hand side, you have the darker tones, the blacks and shadows, and on the right-hand side, the whites and the highlights. Midtones obviously are in the middle. And you can actually drag areas of this to adjust the exposure in different areas of your image if you want to do it like that. If you hover over or click on these 2 triangles in the top corner, this will show you areas where the blacks are completely black. You'll see these little blue highlights here. That's where the blacks are completely black. And it would be the same for the highlights. We don't really have any blown highlights in this image, so it's not showing any. If in this photo I wanted to bring those blacks back, I can just drag this to the right hand side until the blue is gone, and as I do that, below it you'll see the black slider shifting to the right at the same time. Underneath the histogram you have a few options here. Let's start with the crop tool. If you click on that, this is where you can take the picture in and out, do a crop. You can use this arrow on the side to straighten it, or you can maybe try hitting auto, and Lightroom will try and work out what it thinks is straight. It's not always accurate, but it can be a good starting point. If you click on the angle straighten tool, you can use it either vertically like this or horizontally like this, and that can help straighten your image pretty well. If you want to crop the image to be a specific aspect ratio, you can choose something like 16:9 here, and then you can just kind of drag it around with the hand tool and click crop. Eventually you might want to learn some shortcuts. So for the crop tool, we just hit the R key. If you're not sure what the shortcut is, you just hover over the actual icon, and in brackets it will give you the shortcut. Next to the crop tool, we have the spot removal. Shortcut for that is Q, which I use all the time. And then we have the option of clone and heal. You can change the size, you can change the feather, which is how soft the edges of the effect are, and the opacity, which I pretty much always leave on 100. To make the area you're gonna cover bigger, you can use the slider, or you can use the square brackets to go bigger and smaller. Click over the area you want to get rid of, and Lightroom will automatically try and work out the best part of the image to copy from to remove it using the heal option. If you change it to the clone option and click, it will try and clone an area of the image like that, which obviously does not really work. Hit Command Z or Z, and that will take you back a step and undo whatever you just did. So here maybe we want to zoom in on this spot that this guy's got, use the brackets or the slider to make the area smaller to fit, and then if we click on that, Lightroom will try and work out an area that's going to work. If you don't like it, you can hit the / key and Lightroom will try and find something that works better, or you can just drag it to wherever you think is going to work best. Hit Q again to undo. The other option you have, if you've got an area where you want to clone or heal something that's not going to fit in a perfect circle, you can click and drag, and then Lightroom will do the same thing for that area. Hit Q to close the tool. Next up is the red eye correction, which I haven't used for years and years. Can't remember the last time I saw a picture with red eye, but if you do find yourself with that problem, this is pretty intuitive. But let's move on to one I use all the time, and that is the gradient filter. So what this is going to do is it's going to apply a gradient to whichever area of the image you decide to drag it on. Here we've got the exposure setting, and I can slide it up and down like that. If you want to fine tune it, just click on this arrow, and then you've got lots of options. You can choose to adjust temperature, contrast, whatever you feel like. This drop down box for the effect will give you lots and lots of options, and I actually have quite a few saved ones, and also a few that come with some of the presets that I bought from people like Davina and Daniel, and there's a couple here from Neil Redfern and Ferwaristi. With the gradient filter, where you first click will have the strongest effect, and then it will get weaker and weaker as you drag it out to this point. The more you drag this gradient across will determine how gradual the effect is going to be on the actual filter. If you want to check how much effect it's having, you can press the O key and you will see the fallout from left to right on this one. The darker red areas on the left will be where it's close to full opacity for the effect, and where there's no red on the right, that's where the effect is virtually zero. If you click on this little circle here, you can drag it around just to change the effect of where the gradient is applied. Then if you want, you can fine tune it, go back to the panel on the right and see what works best for you. Next up we have the Radial Filter, which works in a similar way to the gradient tool, but instead of using a line, you are now going to be drawing a circle or an ellipse like this, and it defaults to affecting everything on the outside of the circle. So here we can adjust the exposure all the way down. You can see extreme level like this. The point in the middle of the circle is the point where it's not going to be affected at all. But in actual fact, the way that I usually use it is by using it with the invert box checked. So I'm only affecting things inside the circle. So here I might want to brighten his face, and the most it's going to brighten is right in the middle of the circle. You can grab the edges of the circle and adjust how much is affected. You can turn it at the size like this. I quite often use it for faces, just to brighten a face subtly like this. I would definitely recommend being careful with these tools and going for something that's subtle and doesn't look over edited. So here, if I wanted to darken down the areas apart from Danny's face, I can select his face like that, darken down the areas around him. But I still want to darken the right hand side of his face there, which is very bright. So I can just grab this brush and then darken that down, and his shirt like that. So this brush just allows you to be a little bit more fine tuned with where the actual effect is going to be applied. That's before and that's after. Here I would probably brighten up around this eye just a little bit. So I'm going to hit invert. And there you can see. Next up here we have the brush tool, and here you can basically paint on with your brush where you want the effect to be applied. So here, if we were going for increased exposure on his face, you can see we've done that. Again, you can use the slider here to adjust the size of the brush, or the brackets, or even the wheel on your mouse should work. If you click auto mask here, Lightroom will do its best to try to detect edges and make sure that you don't go outside the lines. It all depends on the image how well that works, but it can be pretty good. So here I've lightened his face. If I want to darken his shirt down, I need to click and reopen it, adjust the exposure again, and then I can paint in to take some of the brightness away from his shirt. If it's not quite enough, I can bring that down even more just here. If I click O, you can see it's worked out where his face is pretty well, and down here it's worked out where his shirt is pretty well, and hasn't really gone outside of the lines. The brush tool can be really useful if you want to do a little bit of skin smoothing. Again, be careful with it, don't overdo it. I would drop down the clarity and maybe the texture just a little bit, and then paint in on any skin that might need just a little bit of help. Click O to see where the mask is, and then tweak the adjustments if you feel like it needs it. And if you click the backslash key, you can toggle between before and after to see what difference it's made. And now let's just quickly brighten Danny's face, bring the shadows up just a little bit. Shadows, paint it on. We can bring the exposure up just a little bit there, and that's done. Now let's step down to the basic panel where you first see treatment. You only really need this if you're going to change it from color to black and white, but for now let's leave it in color. Next you have the profile option. If you click on the boxes here, you will see lots of options which are more like kind of LUTs or presets, and you can scroll through those, see whichever you like, but for now let's just keep that on Adobe Color. Next up here we have white balance. You can use some of the presets from the drop down box, see if any of those work well, or you can manually slide the temperature and the tint. Or you can use the eyedropper and put it onto something that should be pretty much white but not blown out. If you drop it onto something that's blown out, it won't work very well. I tend to find this a bit hit and miss, but it can work well, so you might want to try it. Click back in the circle to put it back. One thing you might want to try is if you hover over the adjustment, you can use your up or down arrows to make incremental adjustments, plus or minus 10, or hit shift arrow up and down to make bigger adjustments. So here we have the exposure and contrast, all pretty self-explanatory. If you go over to this side and right click, you'll see the option of solo mode, which is what I always have it in. But if you uncheck that, then whenever you open a tab, the other ones will stay open. But in solo mode, everything else that you're not using will close up. And in each panel, if you click this little box in the top left, you can turn off the adjustments to see what exactly that panel is doing to your image. One other thing you can do is if you right click on the panel, you can go to Customize Develop Panels. Here you can uncheck any panels that you never use, or you can drag and drop these into whichever order you prefer. If you're not sure where to start, you might want to try clicking the auto and see what Lightroom thinks the settings should be. That can quite often be a good place to start. and you can tweak it to your taste from there. Next up in the presence section, we have texture and clarity. A lot of photographers tend to push the clarity up a little bit, thinking it's going to make the image sharper. I actually tend to bring it down, usually to around -13, 15. I bring the texture down as well. It just softens the image just a little bit for me, especially with people's faces. So if you bring it up high, you'll just see it tends to get a bit gnarly and not the most flattering on people. So I bring it down and it just softens it up just a little bit. But if you bring it down too far, you will see people start to get a bit weird. The dehaze slider can just give images a little bit of a kick, a little bit of a punch, but again, be very careful with this. It also tends to increase the saturation, but I found it can work really well on buildings and details just to give it a little bit of richness. Then vibrance and saturation are both going to affect the colors. Vibrance tends to affect the muted colors a bit more, whereas saturation has a more of an overall effect on all of the colors like that. Onto the tone curve. The tone curve allows us to change the tones and the hues of the image and the contrast with just a little bit more control, but again, you have to be careful with this. The graph behind the tone curves kind of mimics the histogram up at the top, and on the tone curve the black point is down here in the bottom left and the white point is at the top right. If you click and drag on the line in the bottom left hand corner, you're affecting the shadows more than the highlights, and if you come up here you'll see you're affecting the lighter areas of the image more than the darker areas. If you click on point curve here, you can click on the line to add some more points, and then you can drag that up and down to your liking. Just try not to overdo it because it can go a bit crazy and you still want it to look as natural as possible. At the moment we're only adjusting the RGB curve, so that affects all hues, RGB, red, green and blue. But if you want to affect certain colors more than others, let's go for the red in this image. You can see as soon as I start moving this, it's only the red hues which are being affected. If I click on the blue, you'll notice the change in the blues. So you can play around with this stuff to your heart's content, see if you can get a look that you really like. But most of the time I would suggest making very small adjustments, and you can toggle this on and off and you'll see exactly what difference your curve is making. Another way to do it is to switch to the parametric curve. Then you get these options down the bottom, which means you can adjust highlights with the sliders. We can raise the shadows a little bit. If I move the shadow slider up and down, you can see on the actual curve exactly what that is doing, as well as in the image. Same with the highlights. Next up is the HSL options, which is hue, saturation and luminance. Here you can tweak colors for the different hues in the image. So if I want the red to be a little bit more red and less orange, then I just bring it down a little bit. The orange is affecting the skin tones quite a lot, so you have to be careful. Now, if I want to change the color of this car, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this adjust hue icon and then click on the car. If I slide up and down, you'll see that it's changing the color of the car. It's moving the red most of all, but also the orange slightly. But you can also see that it's affecting their skin tones ever so slightly. So you have to be careful with this kind of stuff if you're making these adjustments. The worst thing we want is for their skin to look completely unnatural. In the saturation section, we can adjust how much of a color is actually in the image. A lot of people like the muted greens, but if you want vibrant greens, you'll take it to the right. If you want muted greens, then bring the saturation all the way down. And obviously with this car, if we want to take that red out, we can drop it right down. If we want to give it a bit of a kick, we can bring it up. But you'll see the skin tones are being affected and Amber's lips are getting a bit too red. So play with it until you feel like it looks how you want. And then the luminance section handles the brightness of each color. So with the red in the car again, we can make it bright or more subtle. With the orange, it tends to affect the skin tones and can be quite nice if you just push it up just a little bit, but not too much. Dropping the luminance of the greens will affect those colors in the background. They won't pop quite so much. And watch your suit, if I push up the luminance in the blue, makes it much brighter, but it also affects a lot of the whites because whites tend to have quite a bit of blue in with them. So you can see her dress is getting a little bit blown. The color gradient tab used to be called split toning, but now works a lot more like color grading for video. You can add elements of certain colors to your highlights, shadows, or midtones, and using the color wheel you can drag around and you'll see what difference it makes. If you just want to concentrate on one or the other, for example, if we wanted to make our shadows a bit greener, we would bring this wheel towards the green, and the further you go away from the center, the stronger that effect is going to get. I hardly ever take it too far away from the center spot at all. With the midtones, I just tend to warm things up just a little bit, bring it a little bit towards the pink and the red, and with the highlights, I don't really touch it much at all. If you click on this little box here, you do get some options, and you can try out those custom colors. So if we want to warm it up a bit, we hit the yellow, cool it down, hit the blue, somewhere in the middle. That's kind of nice. Play around, see what you like, and you may be able to save it as a preset later on to apply to all your images going forward. I'll be doing a more in-depth video about this, so if you want to see that, make sure you subscribe to the channel, and let's move on to detail. In this section, we can change the amount of sharpening and the amount of noise reduction. The amount of sharpening will just tell you just how sharp your image is going to be. You don't want to overdo it again. I usually leave it around kind of 40-ish. Radius will define the size of the sharpening area. I suggest leaving this around 1 and don't mess around with that slider too much. The detail slider will determine what edges get sharpened. If you leave it low, only the well-defined edges will get sharpened. The more you push it up, the more the finer edges will begin to get sharpened, and you can see a preview in that little box. If you bring the masking slider up, it's only going to really sharpen the parts of the image that it sees as being in focus. So that can actually sharpen the bits that you really want and leave everything else alone. So play around with that, but maybe bring it up to about kind of 60, 70, even higher. If you do have any noise in your image, then noise reduction can help you a lot, but the default in Lightroom tends to work pretty well. And for the most part, I just leave it as it is. Pushing it up too much can reduce the noise, but it can also take away the detail in your image. So just be a little bit careful and make sure you find a nice balance. Some lenses can apply a little bit of a vignette to the image. This is taken on my 85 1.2. And there is a bit of vignetting going on. Some people like it. Usually I try and remove it. So enable profile corrections in lens corrections will adjust by working out exactly which lens you've been using and adjusting the image accordingly for that lens. Occasionally you might notice in some of your images you get a slight line around the edge of the dark areas where they meet the light areas. Sometimes that line can look kind of purple, and that is called chromatic aberration. If you check this box, Lightroom does a pretty good job of removing that as well, so I usually have that checked just in case. Enabling the lens correction can also limit any distortion, especially on wide angle lenses such as 24 and wider. If you apply the lens correction but still want a little bit of vignetting, you can come down here and just drop this down to a level where you like the vignette. You can adjust the amount of lens distortion correction, but usually I just leave this as it is on 100. If you really want to get creative, click on the manual tab and you can make slightly more dramatic adjustments to the distortion. You'll see it bends the edges of the image, but if you click constrain crop, then it's just going to adjust accordingly for that. Okay, so the transform tool, that is going to help you straighten some of these weird lines that you get on buildings sometimes. If you have clear lines that Adobe Lightroom can pick up on, clicking the auto option can make some pretty good adjustments for that. If that doesn't work, you can help it out using the guided option and tell it which lines you want to be straight, just like this, and one there, and one there. In the effects panel, you have the option to add post-crop vignetting. I don't really use this hardly ever at all, but you can play around with that maybe. You can take that down if you want darker edges. You can make the edges lighter. And once you've done that, you can play around with the midpoint, the roundness, and the feather until you get to a point that you like. You can choose to add grain to your images here. You can change the size of the grain and how rough it is. I actually use a program called Alien Skin Exposure to add grain to my images, which I kind of prefer, but this is a nice, easy way of doing it. If we zoom into the shadows, you can see the grain, how much you want, and we can play around with this. Some people don't like it at all, other people really like it, quite strong. It's down to personal taste, so check it out. And then finally, down in the bottom right hand corner, we have calibration, which can make a massive difference to your images by tweaking the colors in each individual pixel in your image. This can be a good panel to just play around with and experiment just to see how each slider is affecting the pixels in your image. It can really make a massive difference. Look. And if you go too far with the color and you want to get back to the point you were before, just hit Command Z and it will undo any mistakes that you might have made. But in this image, the blue saturation makes a massive difference to the image. Look. If at any point you feel like you want to do a bit more in-depth editing using Photoshop, you can always go up to the menu, hit Photo, Edit In, and that will give you the option to open it in Photoshop. Once you're done in Photoshop, just hit save and it will bring it back into Lightroom alongside your original. So you have the two copies. If after you've edited a picture, you have another similar picture that needs to be edited but is in a similar kind of light and all that kind of stuff, you can copy the settings from this picture to the next one, and there's a couple of ways to do that. What I normally do is hit the copy down here. I will check everything and then de-check specific things that might be only good for that original photo, like the crop, spot removal, maybe some adjustments. Sometimes I copy those as well, transform probably. Then we can copy, click the next photo and hit paste. And that's done a pretty good job of taking it from that to that, and then we can go to any kind of cropping or adjustments that we need from there. If you edit one picture and then go to the next one and think it needs pretty much the same thing, you can just hit the previous button down in the right hand side, see how that looks, but that will copy everything including the crop, which here chops off their feet. One last one that can save you a ton of time is the sync option. Just click on the picture that you've edited and then shift click to select a whole batch of images that you think are going to need a similar edit, and then now this button changes to sync. Again, check the boxes that you think apply, hit synchronize, and then you should see all those settings applied to the pictures that you've chosen. This is particularly good with things like group shots and portraits. When you feel like you've edited all the images to your satisfaction, then you want to export them. Go up here, File, Export, and then here you can choose where you're going to put them. You can put them in a subfolder if you decide, and give everything a name. For the file settings, I save everything as JPEG at 84 quality. You can put it to 100 if you like. And for color space, I always choose sRGB. For the image sizing, it depends where you're going to put them. You might want to resize it just for Instagram or social media, but usually I export here at high res with 300 pixels per inch at 6000 on the longest side, and make sure resize to fit is checked. You can add additional sharpening, which I don't. You can add metadata, which I already did on import. Everything else I pretty much leave alone. I'm not a fan of watermarks at all, but I know some people are, so if you want to add a watermark, this is where you're going to do that. And then click export. Now, if you ever find yourself with an edit that you particularly like the look of, you can always make your own presets. Simply go to the plus sign in the presets column here, hit create preset, give it a name, put it in a group, and then choose which of these you want to include. So you might want to leave out white balance, exposure, and maybe some other things like transform. Hit create, and you can apply that to your photos next time you think you're going to need it. So there you go. If you made it to the end, well done. And like I say, I am going to be doing some more in-depth videos about how I actually edit myself. If you're not already subscribed, make sure you hit that subscribe button down below, all that kind of good stuff that we have to say here on YouTube. But otherwise, I'm going to see you in the next video, I hope, and I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks, guys.